You need to stop interfering in our marriage!
Enough with all this nonsense.
The dining room felt smaller than usual that evening. Not physically, emotionally. The sound of silverware touching ceramic plates echoed too clearly through the house, as if nobody at the table trusted silence enough to leave it alone. Elena Marshall sat across from her husband, watching him carefully. David barely looked up from his plate. Margaret sat beside him instead of across from him, a small detail Elena had noticed 3 nights earlier and never corrected. At first, it had seemed harmless. Now it felt intentional. So, Elena said gently, forcing normal conversation into the room, "Did the contractor call you back about the kitchen leak?" David opened his mouth, but Margaret answered first. He said Thursday would be better. Elena looked at her, then at David. A strange pause followed. Because Elena had never mentioned the contractor conversation to Margaret, that discussion had happened privately in their bedroom before sunrise while Margaret was supposedly asleep upstairs. David finally nodded. "Yeah, Thursday." Margaret continued eating calmly, like nothing unusual had happened. Outside, rain tapped softly against the kitchen windows. Elena suddenly realized she couldn't remember the last time she and David had spoken alone without interruption. And somehow, she couldn't remember when the house stopped feeling like hers. Later that evening, the kitchen lights were dim except for the small lamp above the stove. Elena walked downstairs for water. David stood near the counter staring at his phone. The second he heard her footsteps, he flipped it face down. Too quickly. Not guilty. Instinctive. The movement was small, but marriages often collapsed through small things first. "You okay?" Elena asked quietly. David rubbed his face. "Just tired." Behind him, Margaret appeared near the hallway entrance wearing her pale blue robe. She moved slowly tonight. Not weak enough to need help, but weak enough to be noticed. "Marriage gets difficult at your age," she said softly. The comment floated through the kitchen with unsettling calmness. Elena forced a smile. "At our age?" Margaret smiled faintly. "No," she replied. "At the stage where people stop pretending." David avoided eye contact again, and for the first time, Elena felt like there were conversations happening around her that she wasn't part of. That night, the house settled into silence. Elena lay awake staring at the ceiling fan turning slowly above the bed. Beside her, David slept facing the opposite direction. Somewhere downstairs, voices murmured quietly. Elena checked the time. 1:17 a.m. She slipped from bed carefully and stepped into the hallway. The staircase creaked softly beneath her feet as she descended halfway. The voices stopped immediately. Complete silence. Then Margaret's voice drifted upward. "You should go back to bed." Elena froze. She hadn't made enough noise for Margaret to hear her clearly. Downstairs, David sat beside his mother on the couch. Margaret's hand rested gently against his cheek, like he was still a frightened child. And what disturbed Elena most was that David didn't move away. The narrator's voice softened. "Before we go further, if you've been following stories like this on Chaos of Lives, let us know where you're watching from. And if you haven't already, take a moment to like and subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next." Upstairs, Elena stood alone in the dark hallway. Watching her marriage from a distance she didn't understand yet. The following morning, sunlight filled the kitchen. Margaret looked healthier during breakfast than she had the night before. David poured coffee while avoiding tension he clearly sensed but refused to acknowledge. "I was thinking maybe Mom could stay another couple weeks," he said carefully. Margaret looked up. "The doctor said recovery could take several months." David blinked. "Several months?" Even he seemed surprised. "You didn't tell me that." Margaret folded her napkin slowly. "You were stressed already." The answer felt rehearsed. Elena watched them both quietly, and suddenly she noticed something uncomfortable. David looked less like a husband making decisions, and more like a son asking permission. Later that afternoon, Elena entered the guest room carrying folded towels, then stopped. Margaret had unpacked nearly everything. The room no longer looked temporary. Framed family photographs covered the dresser now. Old pictures of David as a child. David at graduation. David beside his mother after his father left. Elena noticed something else. The small decorative candles she'd originally placed there were gone. So was the artwork from the wall. Margaret looked over calmly while adjusting one of the photo frames. "This house never really felt like David before," she said. The words sounded polite, but they landed like criticism. Elena stood there quietly holding the towels, suddenly feeling like a guest inside her own home. Across town, Lena sat inside Elena's parked car after school. Rainwater rolled slowly down the windshield. "She acts different when he leaves the room," Lena said quietly. Elena kept driving. "How?" Lena hesitated. "She smiles different." Elena glanced toward her. "And yesterday," Lena continued carefully, "I heard her call you temporary." The car became silent. "She probably didn't mean it that way." "She did." Lena looked out the window. "She talks about him like he belongs to her." Elena tried dismissing it. But the problem with uncomfortable observations was that once somebody said them aloud, they became impossible to unsee. That evening, Elena sat in her home office finishing invoices when her phone vibrated. Bank notification. Large withdrawal. Joint account. Several $1,000s. Her stomach tightened. Downstairs, she found David near the dining room. "What's this withdrawal?" David looked exhausted already. "It's for Mom's treatment." "What treatment?" Before he answered, Margaret entered carrying tea. The interruption felt perfectly timed. "You shouldn't burden Elena with medical paperwork," Margaret said gently. David immediately fell silent, and Elena realized something disturbing. Every conversation now seemed to end the moment it became specific. Months earlier, the ocean stretched endlessly behind Elena and David during their anniversary trip. Warm wind moved through Elena's hair as they walked barefoot along the shoreline. Back then, David laughed easily, touched her naturally, looked present. They spoke about retirement plans, travel, possibly downsizing the house after Lena graduated. But there had been one strange moment. When Elena casually mentioned visiting Margaret during Christmas, David's mood shifted instantly. Subtle, but immediate. He stared toward the ocean for several seconds before responding. "She gets difficult during holidays." At the time, Elena assumed he meant emotional. Now she wondered if he meant controlling. Later that night, Elena remembered another conversation from years earlier. David had once confessed details about his father leaving. "He walked out when I was 11, David had said quietly. "And my mother kept saying the same thing afterward." Elena remembered the exact sentence. "You're the only man who never abandoned me." At the time, it sounded heartbreaking. Now it sounded dangerous. Because guilt repeated long enough eventually stops feeling like guilt. It starts feeling like obligation. Back in the present, Elena woke suddenly around 2 a.m. David's side of the bed was empty. She walked downstairs quietly. The television glowed softly inside the living room. David slept awkwardly on the couch. Margaret rested beside him beneath a blanket. Her head leaned against his shoulder. One of his hands remained trapped gently between both of hers. The intimacy wasn't romantic. It was worse. It felt emotionally dependent, like boundaries had dissolved years before Elena ever entered the picture. Margaret opened her eyes slowly, and instead of looking embarrassed, she looked calm, almost victorious. 2 days later, the tension followed them outside the house. At a small dinner gathering hosted by friends, Margaret interrupted Elena constantly, corrected harmless details, retold stories Elena was already telling. Each interruption was tiny, polite enough to dismiss, but repetitive enough to exhaust. "And then Elena burned the turkey," Margaret said lightly. Everyone laughed politely. Elena smiled too, but the story wasn't true. David noticed, yet said nothing. Later, while Elena stood alone near the kitchen island, one of the guests approached carefully. "Has she always been this controlling?" Elena looked toward the dining room. Margaret was laughing beside David, her hand resting possessively on his arm. And Elena realized other people could see it now too. The following morning, Elena searched the upstairs bathroom cabinet for aspirin, then paused. Margaret's prescription bottles sat untouched near the sink. Several were nearly full. The refill dates were old enough to matter. Elena frowned. Behind her, Margaret appeared suddenly in the doorway. You shouldn't snoop through other people's pain. Her voice remained soft, controlled. Elena slowly closed the cabinet. I was looking for aspirin. Margaret smiled faintly. Of course you were. And somehow, that felt worse than being accused directly. The following weekend, Elena and David were supposed to leave for a quiet anniversary getaway. Bags already packed. Reservations paid. Then Margaret fell. At least, that was the story. David rushed downstairs after hearing a scream. Elena followed seconds later. Margaret sat near the staircase, clutching her ankle dramatically. But Elena noticed something strange immediately. No swelling. No instability. And when David turned away briefly to grab ice, Margaret adjusted herself effortlessly. The injury disappeared the moment nobody watched closely. The trip was canceled within the hour. Margaret apologized repeatedly, without sounding sorry once. Days later, Elena stood folding laundry while Margaret entered quietly. You shouldn't pressure David so much, she said. Elena froze. The phrase was exact. Word for word from a private argument Elena and David had behind closed bedroom doors the previous night. A conversation Margaret should never have heard, unless David had repeated it. Elena suddenly realized her marriage no longer had privacy, only surveillance disguised as concern. That evening, Elena finally confronted David carefully. Not angrily. Carefully. We need boundaries, she said softly. David immediately looked exhausted. She's recovering, Elena. That's not what I mean. Before she could continue, Margaret appeared near the doorway holding folded towels. The timing felt impossible, like she had been listening. Later that night, Elena heard crying through Margaret's bedroom wall. Not loud, controlled enough to be overheard. Minutes later, David walked past Elena without speaking and entered his mother's room. The door closed, and Elena remained alone in the hallway, feeling strangely removed from her own marriage. Meanwhile, Lena reviewed footage from the small kitchen security camera connected to her phone. Mom, she whispered later that evening. Elena watched beside her. On screen, Margaret moved normally through the kitchen while alone. No limp, no weakness, no trembling hands. He refused to watch more than 10 seconds. That doesn't prove anything. His voice sounded defensive before the conversation even started, which frightened Elena more than denial itself. The following morning, Elena stopped in the hallway. Their wedding photograph was gone. The empty space on the wall looked strangely violent. Have you seen our photo? She asked. Margaret looked up from her crossword puzzle. Oh, it must have fallen. But later, Elena found it hidden inside a downstairs closet. Perfectly intact. No broken glass. No damaged frame. Someone had removed it carefully, and nobody admitted doing it. That afternoon, Elena searched for tax paperwork inside David's office drawer. Instead, she found bank authorization forms. Margaret's name had been added to emergency financial access, signed weeks earlier. David never mentioned it. The realization settled slowly inside her chest. Margaret wasn't simply staying in the house anymore. She was being woven into the structure of their marriage itself. Across town, an elderly woman stopped Elena outside a grocery store. You're David's wife, right? Elena smiled politely. The woman hesitated awkwardly. I knew his mother years ago. Something in her tone changed. She had a hard time with his first engagement too. Elena's expression froze. First engagement? David had never mentioned another fiancé. The woman realized too late what she'd revealed. Oh, but the damage was done already. That night, Elena searched through old storage boxes in the garage. Dust drifted through the flashlight beam. Inside one cardboard container, she found letters. Old ones. Margaret writing to David decades earlier. The language disturbed her immediately. She's manipulating you. She wants to separate this family. She doesn't understand you like I do. The letters described another woman entirely. But the accusations matched Elena almost perfectly. Pattern recognition settled coldly into her stomach. This had happened before. Days later, David stopped sleeping upstairs regularly. He claimed stress, exhaustion, confusion. But Elena noticed something else. His phrases had changed. You've become emotionally aggressive. That's not who you used to be. You're making Mom anxious. None of it sounded like him. It sounded inherited, borrowed, repeated. And Elena slowly realized she wasn't only losing her husband. She was losing his perception of her. That night, rain hammered against the windows during dinner. Nobody touched their food. Finally, Elena looked directly at Margaret. "You need to stop interfering in our marriage." David stiffened instantly. Margaret blinked slowly. "I would never interfere. You repeat private conversations. You manipulate situations. You." "Enough," David snapped suddenly. The room fell silent. Margaret lowered her eyes carefully, like someone wounded unfairly. David turned toward Elena with visible disappointment. "She's sick." Elena stared at him in disbelief. "No, David. She's controlling you." Margaret stood slowly, and just before leaving the room, she leaned slightly toward Elena and whispered softly enough that only she could hear. "You were never supposed to come between us." Elena felt the blood drain from her face, because for the first time, the manipulation was no longer hidden. The following morning, Elena packed quietly. No screaming, no dramatic threats, just exhaustion. David watched from the hallway but never stopped her. Hours later, Elena sat alone inside a small hotel room across town. The silence felt unfamiliar. Her phone barely rang. And what hurt most was how quickly the house seemed able to continue without her. Later that evening, Lena met Elena at a quiet cafe beside the hotel. She looked nervous. "There's something I didn't tell you." Elena listened carefully. "A few nights ago, I heard her talking on the phone." Lena swallowed hard. She said if David felt guilty enough, he'd never leave her. The words sat heavily between them. "And she knew you were listening?" "I don't think she cared." Elena suddenly understood. "Your marriage wasn't only dealing with conflict," she explained gently. "It was dealing with emotional enmeshment." David lowered his eyes immediately, like he already understood the word, even before hearing it defined. Later that evening, a handwritten letter arrived from Margaret. Elena read it alone. The apology sounded careful, regretful even, but something felt incomplete, because most of the letter focused on David, his pain, his loneliness, his confusion. Very little addressed what she'd done to Elena directly, and that realization mattered, because even now, Margaret still viewed herself as the emotional center of the family. That night, David sat alone in the backyard beneath dim patio lights. Elena joined him quietly. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then David finally admitted something he'd probably never said aloud before. "I spent my entire life managing her emotions." He stared into the darkness, and I never realized I was sacrificing ours to do it. Elena listened silently, because sometimes truth arriving late still changes everything. Days later, small moments inside the marriage still felt uncertain. David reached for Elena's hand more often now, but hesitation remained. Not hatred, damage, because betrayal didn't always come from affairs or lies. Sometimes it came from failing to protect the person you promised safety to. And Elena no longer knew whether love alone could rebuild that kind of fracture. 1 week later, Elena visited Margaret alone. The assisted living center smelled faintly of antiseptic and flowers. Margaret looked smaller there somehow. Older, less powerful. They sat together near the window quietly. No screaming, no dramatic confrontation. Just two exhausted women surrounded by consequences. Finally, Margaret spoke softly. "Do you know what it feels like to become unnecessary?" Elena looked at her carefully, and for the first time, she saw not only manipulation, but fear, loneliness twisted into control over many years. It didn't excuse anything, but it made the tragedy feel human. When Elena finally left, Margaret didn't stop her. Early Sunday morning, sunlight spread softly across the kitchen counters. Elena stood alone pouring coffee. The house remained completely quiet. No interruptions, no tension, no whispered conversations downstairs after midnight. Yet somehow, the silence still felt heavy, because peace arriving after emotional destruction rarely feels peaceful at first. The narrator's voice returned gently. "Some relationships don't collapse because love disappears. Pause. They collapse because boundaries never existed." Photographs filled the screen slowly. David alone in the backyard. Margaret sitting silently beside her assisted living window. Elena standing in the hallway holding the old wedding photograph. Sometimes guilt disguises itself as loyalty. And sometimes loneliness becomes possessive enough to destroy the very people trying to love you. That evening, Elena rehung the wedding photograph carefully onto the hallway wall. She adjusted it slightly, then stopped. Her hand remained resting against the frame for several seconds. Unsure, not whether she still loved David, but whether damaged trust could ever fully feel safe again. Behind her, David appeared quietly in the hallway. Neither spoke. The image between them remained slightly crooked, and neither reached to straighten it. The narrator's voice softened one final time. If this story made you think, you can check the screen now and watch our next video, or explore more stories like this on Chaos of Lives.